Good afternoon to our inaugural Encyclopedia Virginia lunchtime event. I'm Patti Miller, editor of Encyclopedia Virginia, and I am so excited to welcome our guest today, Joshua Rothman. And before we get started, I want to just tell you a little bit about Encyclopedia Virginia. We are a free, reliable, user-friendly resource that tells the inclusive story of Virginia for students, teachers, communities, and anyone who seeks to understand how the past informs both the present and the future. We invite you to explore the best and most current scholarship through thousands of entries on encyclopediavirginia.org. We also are very excited to our community partner today, the Alexandria Black History Museum, for helping us spread the word about this event. A couple of notes before we get started. Please share any questions you have in the Q&A, and we will keep an eye on that. And this event also has optional closed captioning, which you can turn on in the closed caption tabs at the bottom of your window. So with no further ado, I'm very pleased to introduce our guest today. Joshua Rothman is a professor of history and chair of the Department of History at the University of Alabama. He's the author of 3 books about the history of slavery in the United States: Notorious in the Neighborhood, Sex and Families Across the Color Line in Virginia, Flush Times and Story of Capitalism and Slavery in the Age of Jackson, and most recently, The Ledger and the Chain, How Domestic Slave Trade Shaped America. And Josh is also the author of Encyclopedia's new entry on Franklin and Armfield, and we're going to drop a link to that in the chat so you can take a look at that. And we also obviously encourage you to buy The Ledger and the Chain and read the whole book. It's an amazing story, one that everyone should be familiar with, and really will stick with you well beyond the reading of the book, as I'm sure as I'm sure it did with me. So, Josh, thank you very much for joining us. You really emphasize in your book how much the story of Franklin and Armfield and the trade isn't real in this country. So first, can you kind of set the stage for us? Tell us who Franklin and Armfield was, both as a company and as people, and why you found them so compelling that you wanted to write a book about them.
Sure. So let me first thank you, Patti, for having me, and thanks to Virginia Humanities, Encyclopedia Virginia, and the Alexandria Black History Museum, and to everybody who's sort of in the Zoom. I appreciate you taking the time in the middle of the day. I do want to make sure we have a lot of time for conversation, so I'll try to just give a couple minutes sort of overview of the book and what it's about and why I think it matters. The Ledger and the Chain, it traces the lives and careers, as you said, of Isaac Franklin, John Armfield, and Rice Ballard, who were the most important domestic slave traders in American history. And by the domestic slave trade, I mean the buying and selling of enslaved people within the boundaries of the United States. And that obviously is something that pre-existed the United States itself, but it really took off in the 19th century as the nation expanded into what was then the Southwest, as white farmers flocked there to capitalize on Indian dispossession and the growth of the cotton economy. And as the federal ban on the transatlantic slave trade took hold starting in 1808. And so that left those farmers who wanted enslaved laborers no choice but to acquire them domestically. Slave traders feed this demand, and no one played a bigger role in the slave trade industry than the man at the center of the book. Now, through their company, which was commonly known as Franklin and Armfield, they trafficked roughly 10,000 enslaved people from the Upper South, particularly Maryland and Virginia, to the Lower South, particularly Louisiana and Mississippi. And they did it really, really fast. The company was founded in 1828. It effectively stopped dealing in human beings in 1836. And yet, in that very short period of time, Franklin, Armfield, and Ballard transformed the domestic slave trade. They turned it from something that white men might do short term for extra money. They turned it from that into a profession, a big business, something that could yield tremendous wealth for its operators. And by doing that, they established a business model for the slave trade that other traders would follow and build upon for decades afterward. Now, obviously, their impact went way beyond the slave trade business. By selling the labor, the bodies, the asset values of enslaved people, slave traders made possible the expansion of the cotton and sugar economies. And the cotton economy in particular was sat at the heart not just of Southern economic growth, but of American economic growth before the Civil War. And the capital that gets extracted from the enslaved as they're bought and trafficked and sold and forced to labor, that capital circulated throughout the entire country and ultimately across the Atlantic Ocean as well. And of course, in the most devastating thing that slave traders and the slave trade did was it absolutely ravaged the families and the communities of enslaved people who fell victim to it. And the numbers involved here are really enormous. Between 1800 and 1860, roughly 1 million enslaved people were forcibly migrated across state lines. Probably about twice as many were bought and sold within individual states. And when you add it all up, an enslaved person was sold somewhere in the United States roughly every 3.5 minutes for decades. And so the book also uses the stories of Franklin, Armfield, and Ballard to kind of trace the broader ebbs and flows of this domestic trade over time, watching it expand and grow in the early 19th century, sort of stagger under the blows of financial disruptions, and then rise up again out of the Depression, only to become nearly as big as it had ever been by the outbreak of the Civil War that finally brought it to an end. So the book covers a lot of the history of slavery, the slave trade, its relationship to the American economy. It tells the story of several men in particular and their business that were central to that history. And it's a hard history to deal with. You read the book. It's not the easiest book to read. I mean, I think it's an easy read, but it's not, the material is heavy. But I think among the hardest things that the book demonstrates is that neither the slave trade nor slave traders ever really suffered for the criticism they faced from the small number of American anti-slavery activists. In fact, the opposite was true. They flourished, both socially and economically. And ideas to the contrary, these are things that Americans often said about the trade and traders, both at the time and for decades after the Civil War. But those ideas they're myths. They're not really true. And the fact that they are myths, the fact that the slave trade was a ubiquitous, a profitable, a widely accepted element of American life before the Civil War, the fact that slave traders could be understood as respectable businessmen, vital to American development, that says some pretty uncomfortable things about the history of the United States. But I think they're things that we need to face squarely and learn how to grapple with and kind of integrate into the way we understand the history of this country. And in some ways, that's ultimately what the book is trying to get us to do.
Thank you, Josh. And I think that's one of the most compelling things about the book is it really does talk about how many places the slave trade touched on. You talk about it really being the central connection between Northern capital flows and the Southern economy. Talk a little bit about how that also dovetailed with the growth of the banking system and capitalism and capital flows in general at that time, because this is something else that's really happening in a big way at that moment that just explodes the slave trade.
Yeah, I mean, one of the reasons that the slave trade is relatively small compared to what it would become in the 19th century. One of the reasons that it was difficult to be really a professional slave trader in the late 18th and early 19th century, it's not just because enslaved people could still be legally imported from Africa. It's because the banking system is pretty immature. There's simply not a lot of money flowing through the United States. Places on the frontier, for example, were often still working very heavily under a barter economy. It's a cash poor society. The economy simply doesn't work like a modern economy would. But what starts to happen, particularly after the end of the War of 1812, is you get a growing number of banks. You get a greater sort of regulatory role for the Second Bank of the United States, right, which is rechartered in 1816. And under the leadership of Nicholas Biddle, actually does pretty well for the economy for a while. Um, and uh, uh, and then of course, you get Jackson's war on that bank. So that bank continues to exist, but its regulatory powers are really lessened significantly. And what that helps to create is really just a proliferation of state and local banks of various kinds. And so and where is the hot spot to put that money in the 1820s and 30s? It's in the cotton economy. So you have all of this money from all of these new banks that's just flooding into the Southwest. Some of that capital is coming from overseas, from merchant banks in England. And so you have just this rapid expansion and maturity of the banking system, of the credit system. People can buy things by borrowing money in ways that they couldn't before. And one of the things that they want to borrow money for, that they want cash for, are enslaved laborers. So yeah, I mean, the growth of American capital and the growth of American slave trade, they go hand in hand. I wouldn't necessarily say that one causes the other, but there is this sort of reciprocal relationship between the two of them.
And from that, it seems that the conclusion is a bit unavoidable that quickly the northern banking economy and the northern shipping economy and the northern manufacturing economy also become linked to this trade very quickly.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, it's almost, once the slave trade becomes really big business and cotton is really a critical part of the American economy, the money in the cotton, it circulates everywhere. There's no way to kind of really disconnect yourself from that market system.
And talk a little bit about the other business practices that Franklin and Armfield really pioneered in terms of applying them to the slave trade. What else did they do that made them different from everybody else at the time?
Yeah, I mean, their ability to capitalize on the credit system ultimately, I think, is if you had to pick one big factor that sets them apart, it's the fact that by the time Franklin and Armfield was created in the late 1820s, Isaac Franklin had been a slave trader for 20 years by that point. He'd been working in Natchez and New Orleans for decades. He has all kinds of connections to merchants and bankers and planters. And so that puts him in a really great position to get access to credit lines that help their business grow in a way that nobody else really could at the time. So, I mean, if there's one factor that does it, that's it. But there are other things that make the business work, right? I mean, no matter how well a banker knows you, they're not just going to throw money at you if they don't think you can pay it back and make them money. And so a lot of what Franklin and Armfield do, it's interesting because I wouldn't say they necessarily pioneer a lot of the methods that they use. What they do is they take things that really just only a small number of other traders had ever done before, and they put it all together and they make it bigger. Right. So in before Franklin and Armfield, really the biggest player in the regional domestic slave trade, the long distance trade in the Chesapeake, at least, is Austin Woolfolk, who works out of Baltimore. And if you read on the domestic slave trade, you'll read about Woolfolk. Frederick Douglass talks about him as being the sort of the real demon in Maryland, where Douglass grew up. And Woolfolk had, instead of sort of working out of a bar, he had a house, a regular office, and his own private jail and headquarters. So he's like an established businessman and not just some guy you'd meet in the tavern. Woolfolk is mostly running people by ship rather than walking them over land, which is a little more expensive, but it's faster, it's more efficient, it's more reliable. And he also has a series of agents who work for him. So Woolfolk is based in Baltimore, but he has a whole network, mostly of family members, who are out in the countryside buying people on his behalf. And then he's got other family members down initially in Georgia and then eventually in New Orleans, who are receiving the people he ships and then selling them in that city. And Franklin and Armfield's model is very similar to Woolfolk's. They have a headquarters at the townhouse in Alexandria. They rely, at least 90% of their business is run by shipping rather than the overland coffle system, although they do the coffle system too. They have an enormous, like an army of agents and sub-agents. By the time you add them all up, there's, when you fold the sub-agents in, it's probably several dozen men who are just taking Armfield's money, going out in the countryside, and they're just handing out cash for enslaved people. And so, Woolfolk did all those things too, but Franklin and Armfield do it bigger and better than he did. Eventually, they almost put him out of business. So when you put all that together with the access to credit and capital, that's really what makes Franklin and Armfield tick.
And the thing that many people are most familiar with about Franklin and Armfield is their so-called slave pen or slave jail on Duke Street in Alexandria. It was visited at the time by some abolitionists. So we have some primitive descriptions of this square block encampment they basically built. Talk a little bit about how that worked for them, what that gave them in terms of a leverage point regionally in the Mid-Atlantic.
Yeah, I mean, their facility is really massive. There are slave jails all over the Upper South. There was Woolfolk's, there was, the Yellow House in Washington City, in DC. There are a few others that are pretty famous and well known at the time. Of course, then you get later in the antebellum period, you get the Devil's Half Acre in Richmond. And so there are slave jails everywhere in the Upper South. Franklin and Armfield's is probably the biggest one that there is. It's probably the best known that there is. And some of that is because they put advertisements in the newspaper every single day. There are periods where they don't appear, but by and large, there's a Franklin and Armfield ad in the papers in DC and Alexandria every day for years. And what that, again, getting back to what Woolfolk said would set him apart was that a lot of slave traders, when you see their advertisements, they say, well, I can be found at such and such a tavern, or you can leave a message for me at the post office. And that was a lot of how the slave trade worked, particularly early in the 19th century. But by setting up a headquarters, right, and saying, look, I'll be in my office every day. You can come and it's a 3-story townhouse. There was a lawyer built it and lived there with his family for a long time. It's a country townhouse basically. And so you'd go in and you'd visit this place and you'd walk in the front door and Armfield would offer you a drink, and he's dressed like a respectable businessman. He's got his clerks working there, writing away. This was just a regular business. And the fact that it could be so large and so well known, it has a kind of gravitational pull on the regional trade. And so you start to see the whole slave trade shift from Baltimore down to Alexandria, partially as a consequence of Franklin and Armfield. So, it's the size, it's the visibility, it's the veneer of respectability. All of that comes together to really work for Franklin and Armfield's benefit. And it was an image that they cultivated very self-consciously. They didn't make any secrets about, their business being, a pretty dirty business where some pretty nasty things were going to happen. But, the image that they present to the world is, we're businessmen like any other businessmen. We run a clean ship here. We're not crooked. We're not going to steal from you. We're offering. You get pretty crass with the slave trade pretty quick, but to them, what was merchandise, right? They offered customers sort of the best deal that they could, and that like any other business, that's the way that headquarters really works for them.
And talk a little bit, Josh, about why, especially in Virginia, the whole Upper South, Maryland certainly too, but especially in Virginia, it was such a profitable place to be buying up people. What happened between the Panic of 1819, between the crash of the tobacco economy in Virginia? Why were there so many people to be sold, and why did it change? Many people were reluctant to sell their enslaved people to slave traders, but did this make this a more palatable option for people to do this because they were so respectable?
Yeah, probably. I think the idea that slaveholders were really reluctant to sell enslaved people to traders, I think that's sort of overblown. That's something that slaveholders like to say. They probably like to believe it. But the truth is, if they needed money, they're gonna sell people. They're not under any delusion that that's not gonna happen. They might tell enslaved people that's not going to happen. They might like to tell themselves that's not going to happen. But yeah, if your farm is having a problem because you're turning over from tobacco to wheat, maybe it's not as profitable. Maybe you don't need as many people as all of a sudden you have a large enslaved labor force for a tobacco farm that maybe becomes a wheat farm, and all of a sudden you realize I don't need this many laborers anymore. What else are you going to do with them? You sell them because they cost you money otherwise. So yeah, I mean, I think there probably are slaveholders who would prefer to sell to somebody like Franklin and Armfield because they could at least tell themselves it wasn't true, but they could tell themselves that that Franklin and Armfield would make sure that the people they were selling would end up in a decent place. It's outright nonsense, right? There's no truth to that at all. But I think there are people who like to be able to say that at least they weren't selling people to, some dirtbag who showed up on their front door one day.
And you talked, Josh, really about the different elements that made them so successful in the entry that you wrote for us for Encyclopedia Virginia, and you tell us a little bit about whether besides the average and the capital flows, is that they were just really good at their command over the process of turning people into goods, is the phrase you use in our entry. Talk a little bit about that, because that really was that kind of dehumanizing step that just made this like another business. How did that work?
So I'm sorry, you broke up in the middle there.
Sorry. You talk about they were very good at the process of the dehumanizing process of turning people into goods.
Yeah. I mean, all slave traders, if they're going to be successful, have to do that. Right. I mean, that's literally their business, is turning people into goods. And in a lot of ways, the key element to that is, I think there could be argued there are different ways of looking at that. But to me, the key element to that is there's just no sentimentality to it at all. Right. You look at an enslaved person, all you want to know is, how much should this person cost me? How much do I imagine that I can sell them for in the market where I'm bringing them? And so what that means is you're really just looking at, physical characteristics, age, health, sex. Are there any particular skills that this person has? Those are the only things you care about, right? Whether or not this person has a family, not your problem. Whether or not this person is is getting sort of torn out of a community that they've been in, not your problem. That is really the key element of that process. And Franklin and Armfield, I don't know that they're better at that than other slave traders are, but they are very good at it. And that there really is a way in which they put, it's an interesting thing, because on the one hand, I don't actually think that they ever get to a place where they don't see enslaved people as human, right? I mean, we use the term dehumanizing. It's not so much dehumanizing, it's degrading. And it is, it's absolutely devastating to individual people. But I actually don't think it's dehumanizing at all. I mean, what makes enslaved people so valuable, as opposed to, say, farm equipment or livestock. We often hear, well, that it's like livestock. It's not like livestock. Livestock isn't as valuable as enslaved people, because enslaved people are people, right? That's the whole point. Being people, being intelligent beings, sentient beings who can make decisions for themselves like any other person. That's exactly what makes them valuable. And so the issue there is not so much dehumanizing people, it's the willingness to not care about the level of degradation that you're willing to introduce to those people's lives to make them saleable.
And I think it's hard for us to conceive of the incredible demand that there was for enslaved people in the Lower South. You say at one point they're sending a shipload of people to New Orleans every 2 weeks for months at a time. How many people are we talking about over the course of, how many people were on a ship, and how many people were we talking about over the course of a year that they were sending south?
So that varies. It varies pretty widely. It's not actually a sort of, it's overall sort of a steady growth, from 1828 forward, but it does sort of ebb and flow a little bit, even as it, the overall track of the line on an XY axis would be up. At the peak, they're moving, I think the most I ever saw them moving in a year was close to 2,000 people, but not every year is like that. The first couple of years in the trade, it's probably fewer than 1,000. Overall, it comes probably to between 8,000 and 10,000 people. When you fold in the numbers that they trafficked in before they get together, right? Because all three of them were traders before they get into business together. You throw all those numbers together, it's well over 10,000. Just these three guys are responsible for that. The number of people on a ship could also vary. There are some voyages where we have the manifest and Armfield is only shipping, maybe 20 or 30 people, and he's got the hold filled with something else or not filled at all, right? The boat was promised that it was going to go, off it goes. But there are months at a time where they're moving as many as a couple hundred people at a time on a ship. I think the biggest shipment they ever send, I think, is about 255 people. And it's one of the last ones they sent, is one of the biggest. So, anywhere from a few dozen to a couple hundred is the answer.
And so they start out originally just buying space on ships that are already going down to New Orleans. But eventually they have three of their own kind of custom built slave ships that they're moving back and forth. How important was that to the scale of what they were able to achieve?
Oh, it's hugely important. One thing that makes John Armfield in particular so successful, right? So if Isaac Franklin's the money man, Armfield is really the logistics and shipping man, right? He knows how the money works too, and he has banking connections, but Franklin is the real sort of banking guy. Armfield discovers as he gets into the shipping side of things that he's pretty good at it. He can figure out how to make it work. And yeah, you're exactly right. Initially what they do is, so first they start renting space on other people's ships. Then they start chartering entire ships. So Armfield would basically say, okay, I'm going to fill your boat. How much money do you want for me to rent your whole boat for this voyage? And then he'd offer his services to other slave traders and say, look, I've got space. You pay me. I'll arrange for whatever or whoever you want to get shipped on this vessel. But by 1831, what they realize is, first of all, they have a lot of money sitting around they need to park somewhere, and parking it in things like real estate and ships and other sort of tangible bits of the slave trade infrastructure is a good place to put it. They custom fit their own brigs. And what that lets them do is there are no middlemen involved, right? It's not Armfield paying somebody else to rent their boat, and then Armfield's basically the middleman between that and slave traders. Armfield basically is like, I got a boat, I'm renting space on it, you pay me, and I'll make sure that they get from point A to point B. And now slave traders know it's not just some boat, right? This is a boat specifically designed for the slave trade. And so what it lets Franklin Armfield do is several things. One thing it does is it brings in extra money, right? Because slave traders would pay per person to ship people from the upper to lower South. So it's a revenue stream for the company. It lets them sort of keep an eye on other people's businesses, right? Because when a slave trader would show up and say, okay, I'm going to ship, I need room for 50 people. That tells Armfield, all right, well, let's see what kind of people you got. And if you can afford 50 people, that makes you somebody of a decent size, right? It lets you check out the competition and get intelligence that you might not get otherwise. And there's also revenue stream that they pull in from bringing things back on those ships, right? Because a ship will get to New Orleans. Sometimes it just comes back with ballast. But a lot of times what you see are these ads in the paper where they're bringing back cotton, sugar, molasses, and smaller things, bear's oil, all of these things that were important to the Atlantic economy that merchants really from New York all the way down to Richmond are like, okay, well, I need those things brought back from New Orleans. Can I arrange for you to ship it to me on your boat? And Armfield would say, sure. And that's more money for the company. So there are a lot of ways in which having their own vessels are another element of helping the company stay successful.
So we have Franklin and Armfield, they have their own ships, they have this massive headquarters in Alexandria, they have access to capital flows, but in the end, they're only in business for about 10 years, give or take. Yeah. So what happens that they're only around for about a decade?
Yeah, so, it's kind of amazing. One of the things I mentioned in the book is really one of the reasons that they're so successful is that they're lucky. They're just lucky. They get started in 1828, and maybe that's not entirely luck, right? You could sort of look at the economic landscape and say, okay, this is a really good time to get in. But you couldn't have known how good a time. You couldn't have known how the economy would just explode in the early 1830s, right? They got lucky. And getting out in 1836, I mean, they send their last shipment of enslaved people to the Lower South 3 months before the Panic of 1837. And yes, they do have some sense that the economy is shaky, that something is not going to hold, right? But that's not the only reason they get out, right? It seems like that would be the reason they get out. And there is that, right? I mean, there's just intuition that Franklin has. It's like, I don't know if we really want to keep doing this. But that's not the only reason that they get out. There are a number of reasons. One of them, I think, is that sort of intuition that maybe this is a good time for us to move on. But another reason was that Franklin was getting old. Not age-wise. Age-wise, he's only, in 1836, he's only, in his late 40s. But he'd been a slave trader for like 30 years. And it's just, his body just started to fall apart. He got tired of traveling back and forth from Natchez to New Orleans over and over and over and over again. And then spending his summers going back to Tennessee, up to New York to deal with bankers. He just didn't want to do it anymore. And he had talked about wanting to get out of the slave trade for several years. He kept trying to get out. They thought they were going to bring one of his nephews in to take over the company, and so he could retire. And then his nephew dies. So he's like, oh man, I got to do this again, right? And obviously they don't have to do anything. They make a choice to do this over and over. But that in some ways is sort of the biggest single factor for why they shut it down. They could have kept making money. But really it's a combination of sort of wariness about the economy. And just once Franklin really was like, all right, guys, this is it. I'm really out this time. Armfield and Ballard, they just didn't want to do it without him. They didn't have quite the connections that he did. They just felt like, okay, we've done what we can do. We got plenty of money here. Let's shut it down and move on.
And they plenty of money. They all, they retired. They took the money out of the firm before the economy crashed. How did they live in retirement? What does this tell us about who they were kind of socially at the time?
They lived quite well in retirement, as you might imagine. The Panic of 1837 doesn't help, right? Because they have all of these loans that they still owe to banks, but they also have customers who owe them hundreds of thousands of dollars. So they're trying to pay their bank loans on the one hand and collect as much money as they can from people who are really struggling. I mean, they're losing plantations and they're selling enslaved people. But nonetheless, like the money flow is the money flow, and they're going to come out on top, even in the Panic of 1837. It takes a lot of lawsuits. It takes a lot of time, but they do it. They have moments where Franklin was always bitching and moaning about something, always complaining, always worried that he was going to run out of money. Oh my God, it's the end of the world. That was never really true. It felt true to him because worrying about money was his thing, but it was never really true. Franklin goes on, and he's got an enormous plantation in Tennessee. a mansion that he built on it that people said was nicer than Andrew Jackson's mansion at the Hermitage. He's bought half a dozen plantations in Louisiana. You know, by the time Franklin dies in the middle of the 1840s, you know, he's enslaving 700 people. You know, he's one of the richest men in the South. You know, and you know, he marries a woman from an elite family, and you know, his obituary runs all over the country. You know, he's a famous rich man, and people, particularly in the South, didn't ask too many questions about where the money came from. Ultimately, they didn't care that much where the money came from. Rice Ballard, very similar. Ballard, after the company shuts down, he gets another business partner. They go into investments in land and enslaved people. They enslave a little more than 400 people on, again, also about half a dozen plantations. The number they own fluctuates over time because they're really just flipping places. They're buying and selling constantly. And there's only maybe 5 or 6 that they actually hold on to and run. John Armfield is an interesting one because he never wanted to be a farmer. He didn't like farming. He didn't want to be a plantation owner. He does own a small plantation. He enslaves you know, a relatively small number of people relative to Franklin and Ballard, at least, maybe a few dozen. But that's not really how he makes his money. He becomes a cotton broker for a while. He's collecting bills for Franklin and Armfield. Like, that's his job, is to be the bill collector. He eventually runs a resort hotel in the Tennessee mountains where he sort of retires, and, you know, he's happy to be the sort of, just like he was when he opened up the office to abolitionists and said, come take a look at my business. He loves being the guy he loves being the guy, basically. Rich people would come and they'd stay at his hotel, and, you know, he's the sort of impresario of this mountain resort, and he loves that. And he dies on that mountain. That's where he's buried. So yeah, all three of them they retire rich, they retire successful, they retire very well respected by people, particularly in Southern society, which is where they spend most of their time. And the idea that their money's all made in the slave trade would be somehow, you know, too dirty for other people to deal with. I mean, the grand scheme of the slave trade and slave traders, right? There certainly are slave traders who are disdained by other white people, right? Because they're sort of fly-by-night operators. You know, they come from nowhere. They're these kind of really low-life guys who you never knew where you bringing these enslaved people from. You know, if I have a problem 3 months from now, where can I find you? Who knows? But those are the reasons why they're disdained. It has nothing to do with the fact that they are slave traders. It's the fact of kind of how they run their particular business. Franklin and Armfield, you know, the bigger and more successful a slave trader was, the more respectable that they were. And the idea that the slave trade would make them sort of, you know, people wouldn't touch them, it's just outright nonsense. It's just a lie.
And obviously, you know, they go out of business. I think you say, when did they finally wrap up the business affairs were wrapped up in the late 40s or so?
They've collected so that they officially disbanded the company in the early 1840s. Mm-hmm. Because by that point they're like, okay, we've done most of what we're going to do here. Because there's always, you know, cleaning things up and collecting money, and you know, they still got the ships and things like that. And they're still collecting money through the 1840s. The final balance sheet of the company is filed, I think, in 1853. So they collect money for like almost 20 years after they close the business down. So there's a trickle of revenue that's coming into everyone's accounts for decades.
And clearly, you know, their retirement did not end the domestic slave trade. I mean, the headquarters building they had in Alexandria was in operation to the Civil War. Yep. So talk a little bit about how they influenced the larger trade and the arc of that through to the you know, the war and the end of the end of slavery period.
Sure. So, you know, the slave trade, like everything else in the economy, takes a pretty big hit from the Panic of 1837. The numbers clearly go into steep decline. The number of slave traders goes into decline. The number of customers who wanted to buy enslaved people goes into decline because people just didn't have any money. By the middle of the 1840s, though, it's going like gangbusters all over again. In the 1850s, it's interesting, slave prices basically correlated with cotton prices for the whole 19th century. But there are a few moments where where slave prices seem to become delinked from cotton, and they just skyrocket. And the 1850s is one of those moments. It's a moment where slaveholders are just looking for places to put their money, and they're packing it into enslaved people. And so the prices go through the roof. The volume of the slave trade in the 1850s is not quite as much as it was in the 1830s, but it's almost as much. And so, the slave trade, it rises from the 1820s to 1830s, goes down in the 1840s, and then goes back almost again to the peak in the 1850s. And the slave traders, the business model that the big slave traders follow by the 1840s and 50s, it looks a lot like Franklin and Armfield. Big businesses set up in major cities with headquarters, armies of agents, connections to banks. They're using the railroad and the telegraph because technology changes things. But the general trajectory of the trade, if you look at sort of how did people operate after Franklin and Armfield compared to how did they operate before Franklin and Armfield, what you notice by the 40s and the 50s is that the really big successful slave traders worked a lot like Franklin and Armfield because that business worked. They showed how you could do it and make it a profession. And so other traders who get involved after they get out, they do what they do.
And I don't know how much we're partnering with the Freedom House for this and the Alexandria Black History Museum about what happened with their physical plant, if you will, in Alexandria once the war started.
Yeah, no, I've been very lucky to be involved in some consulting work with them, and they're hoping to reopen the building as a museum come the fall. And from what I've seen of their plans so far, it's really exciting. They've gotten a huge influx of money from the city and from the state, which was desperately needed because that building it was a lot to maintain, and it was sort of falling apart. And so it's great to see. It was heroic work by organizations like the Urban League in Northern Virginia just to keep it afloat. But now it looks like the building is really going to get what it needs, and it's exciting to see what it'll become. What happens to it during it stays a slave trade operation through right up to early 1861. The U.S. Army comes in, one of the first places they get, obviously, because they're moving out of the District of District Columbia into Virginia right away. And they liberate the slave pen. They start using it as a prison. They use it as a prison for Union deserters, Confederate prisoners. It becomes sort of housing for a small number of freed people and refugees. By the end of the war, parts of it are a military hospital. And so, it evolves into different things over the course of time. And I think I sort of lose track of what happens to it sort of by kind of the late 19th century. I know it stays a hospital for a while. It eventually becomes a private home again. Then becomes becomes part of the Urban League's headquarters and a small museum when it becomes Freedom House. And that's sort of really what it's been now. But yeah, during the Civil War, like abolitionists would come and take souvenirs and check it out, right? Because they'd be based in DC and they're working with refugees, so sometimes they're coming there to do that. But that physical plant really is symbolic of particularly for a lot of enslaved people and for white Northerners of the really sort of the heart of the beast of American slavery. And so seeing it liberated and turned into other things is it's a big moment for them in a lot of ways.
And we have a question from one of our viewers that's really related to that. So many people's ancestors did pass through there. Is there, you're so familiar with the records of Franklin and Armfield, obviously. Is there enough information of people, of names, that anyone would be able to trace their ancestors through what remains of their archives or their records? Or is it just, we sent 10 people, 2 or 50, 5 were men, 5 were women? Is there any way to?
Oh no, I mean, it's not easy for anyone to do that. But both ship manifests and sales records in New Orleans, at least, not in Natchez, but in New Orleans, these are accessible, and you can, I mean, you see people's first and last names often, not always, but often. Their ages, their sex, their how white people judge their color. In New Orleans, you can often see who those people were sold to. So yeah, no, I mean, there are today, if you wanted to take into account, okay, how 10,000 enslaved people, how many people is that today? It's hundreds of thousands, probably over 1 million people today who could theoretically trace their ancestry directly to people trafficked by Franklin and Armfield. Those people cannot always be tracked, right? The genealogy gets tricky. Crossing over the boundary of slavery from 1860 to 70 is very challenging. But certainly there are thousands of people living today who can and who have traced their ancestry directly to Franklin and Armfield, to the house in Alexandria, to their headquarters in Natchez or New Orleans. Absolutely can be done, and often is done.
And one of our other questioners says, this is such a chilling subject. And their question is it true that one of Franklin's plantations in Louisiana is currently Angola prison? I don't know if you are aware of it.
That is absolutely true.
And he says that's a really fascinating, obviously, connection between slavery and mass incarceration.
Yeah, so Franklin names that place Angola. He has 6 plantations in Louisiana. They're all contiguous, right? So it's one big piece of property, but it's subdivided into different plantations, different overseers, different things are going on in different places. 3 of the places were named before he gets involved, and he names 3 other ones. And one of the ones that he names is Angola. And after he dies, it's sort of convoluted, but the long and short of it is that his widow takes possession of those properties. She remarries a Louisiana planter, and then that planter dies during the Civil War, and Franklin's widow ultimately sells the property in Louisiana to a man who has the contract to run the state prison from Louisiana. And he runs it for a while, and it's a lot of convict leasing, really sort of dirty post-Civil War labor practices in the South, very reminiscent of slavery. Eventually, in fact, he is so corrupt and so runs such a physically punishing operation that the state takes over. And runs the state penitentiary on that ground. And it's still there. That is still Louisiana State Penitentiary at Angola. The property now is 18,000 acres. So it's more than twice as big as it was when Franklin owned it. But the core of it remains Franklin's property, and Angola was the name that they took to give to the penitentiary system.
And you spoke about his widow and how that property lived on. Someone else asks, were you able to work with any of the descendants of the slave traders themselves? Were you able to trace their ancestry at all?
Yeah, so neither Franklin nor Armfield has any living direct white descendants. Both of them probably have I know that Armfield has living black descendants. Franklin probably does too, but they're impossible to trace. Theoretically, they could be traced, but I don't know if it's actually possible. Ballard also has black descendants who maybe could be traced, but I lose track of the women involved. They sort of seem to disappear from the records. Ballard has living direct white descendants. I did not track them down. I don't know who they are, but I'm sure that they are alive. Franklin and Armfield have no direct white descendants, but Franklin had a very large family. lots of brothers and sisters. And John Armfield actually marries one of Franklin's nieces and raises some of her nieces and nephews as his own children. He sort of takes them in as wards. So there are people descended from people who effectively were children of John Armfield and related to Isaac Franklin. And yes, I have been in contact with a fair number of them. They've been enormously helpful on my research. It's been fascinating for me to hear as they sort of process kind of the understanding of their own ancestry. And it, you know, it's to their credit, they're not people who want to hide from this history or pretend that it didn't happen. What it means for them, I think, to reckon with the reality of having that as their ancestry, it's difficult, and I don't envy them that task. It's a weird sort of burden because they're not personally responsible for it, but they feel a responsibility as a consequence of simply being born into it, and sort of how you navigate that is something that I think it's still an ongoing process.
It is an interesting process, I'm sure, for people. One of the questions, no one wants to be on the wrong side of history. Obviously, sure. Everyone likes to think their relatives fought the good war and fought the good fight. Someone asked, what did they think about abolitionists? How did they regard abolitionists, Franklin and Armfield? Did they try to thwart them? There's rumors that some of them tried to, physically attack them. However, did let them into their facility and show.
Oh yeah, Franklin and Armfield don't worry about abolitionists. They don't care. They're not worried about it. There's nothing in their letters that says that abolition has really given them much of a problem. In the abstract, obviously they're opposed to abolition. In the abstract, I think they see abolition as a potential threat, but they don't really spend a whole lot of time thinking too hard about it. If abolitionists want to come and sort of check out their headquarters, they'll give them the tour.
They give them the tour.
They do. They give them the whole song and dance, right? It's a lot of propaganda about how, we try not to separate families. We're sending them someplace better than their situation was in Maryland and Virginia. And abolitionists don't necessarily believe that. But what's really interesting is you see these abolitionists who, they come away from visiting Franklin and Armfield's headquarters and they're absolutely disgusted and disturbed by the slave trade. But a lot of them are like, John Armfield didn't seem like such a bad guy. And it shows you just how sort of persuasive he could be. It shows you how much, the idea that that abolitionists, they're dealing with a guy who he's white like them, he's respectable like them, he dresses like them, he talks like them, he's in a filthy, disgusting business, but maybe he wouldn't be so bad if he wasn't in that business. And the fact that he can even get abolitionists to see things that way is kind of incredible. And that's not always true, right? Austin Woolfolk, who I mentioned before, he beats an abolitionist down in the street. The guy writes nasty articles about him in the newspaper. Woolfolk hunts him down. He's like, "You write those articles?" And the guy's like, "Yeah." Pummels him in the street. Franklin and Armfield didn't work like that. They
literally offer people tea. They're like,
yeah,
"Would you like
they
tea?
do. You want a drink? Is it hot out? It's hot outside today. Why don't you come in and cool off?" They were fine with it.
It wasn't masterful propaganda because the walls were so famous around the Alexandria compound, and yet they say, "Come right in." Sure. And you're left with the feeling when they leave, they're talking about people like looking after horses or something like that. They seem very clean and very well taken care of, and all the children were neat and seemed cheerful. And it's just like, well, yeah, but that's not, it's not livestock, it's right. People. But yes, obviously, even the abolitionists seem thrown off their game by that. They would kind of creep up.
I wouldn't say they're not right. They're not convinced, but it throws them off their game. They expect one thing, and then they get to Alexandria. It's like, this wasn't really what I thought it was going to be, and I don't know what to do with
that. And we have one other question. Did they ever sell enslaved people to owners in Western Virginia?
Not really. They buy enslaved people from owners in Western Virginia. And by Western Virginia, I really mean sort of, kind of Winchester, sort of Blue Ridge Mountains, not really like Western Virginia. They don't get to the other side of the mountains, and they're not buying people from there. But yeah, anywhere as far west as really as the mountains and the fall line there. You know, they're buying people from there. They don't really sell people in Virginia. I mean, they would, right? If somebody came to the Alexandria headquarters and said, I want to buy people, armed people would certainly sell them people. But the goal from the Virginia side is really intake and then shipment someplace else, rather than but buying and selling. It's disproportionately buying compared to selling.
Right, because the money was made in the transport. It was
Exactly.
expensive to transport people, and you could way mark up the price when you got somebody south.
Exactly.
If you sold them locally,
and the demand is so much higher in the lower South. I mean, that's where the profit is. But they do sell people to owners in to enslavers in Virginia proper. There, you know, Ballard in his record books, you can see he would sometimes sell people to people in Virginia, but not really all the way out in Western Virginia. I mean, that's if there were, it'd be very unusual.
Well, I think that is all we have time for today. Josh, is there anything you want to close with? You know, you really talk about how the domestic slave traders shaped America. What's the one thought you want us to leave with about your book and about this time in America?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's lots of ways that the slave trade and the people who perpetrate the slave trade shape what America was and what America becomes. And I think, look, some of that is just the money, right? The money circulates everywhere, and it continues to circulate everywhere, right? Yes, enslaved people are no longer commodities after the Civil War, but all the money that is kicked off by them, right? Whether it's labor put into the cotton economy, whether it's the leverage that banks can use by having enslaved people who are mortgaged to them, whatever it is, there's all kinds of money that's extracted from enslaved people. That money's around us every day. It's still here. It doesn't disappear with the Civil War. So that's one way, but I think there's another way too, which is maybe a little bit less tangible, which is that, you know, we know today that things like the wealth gap and mass incarceration, I mean, you can go down the line anywhere in American society and find racial disparities. And, you know, in pre-Civil War America, you know, when you saw Black people, right? If you were a white person, you saw Black people in pre-Civil War America. Certainly there are plenty of free people of color, right? Both in the South and in the North. But the overwhelming majority of Black people before the Civil War are enslaved. You would see them working in any number of places, plantations, factories, shipyards, wherever it is, if there's work to be done, an enslaved person's doing it somewhere. But what you would also see is you'd see people in handcuffs and chains and jails and on auction blocks. And what the slave trade does and what slave traders do is they get Americans used to the idea of seeing that as something that's perfectly appropriate, right? That Black people in prisons and in chains, that's normal. Like, that's okay, because you needed to do that if you were going to use them for what you wanted to use them. And I think there's something to that. Again, it's not tangible, but the idea that was sort of that was a suitable position for Black people to be in. The slave trade does that maybe more than anything else in American life. And that, I think, outlasts the Civil War. It carries on into convict labor. It carries on into mass incarceration. It carries on into all other elements of American society when you think about what's the position Black people should be in, that we're used to seeing them in. And I think we still have elements of that. Again, it's not something you can say, okay, this is point A to point B. But the connection there, I think, is undeniable.
Thank you so much, Joshua Rothman, the author of The Ledger and the Chain, How the Domestic Slave Trader Shaped America. It's a fascinating read, not an easy read, but a fascinating read. Also the author of our newest entry in Encyclopedia Virginia about Franklin and Armfield. Thank you for your time. Please check out the book, and thanks everyone for attending today.
Thank you.
Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.